Good morning. How is everyone? Well rested? Who stood up for the fireworks? Is there a football game on New Year's Eve? It's a college or NFL? It's not NFL. College? Who played? Georgia and who? Ohio? Who won? Georgia did? Hey! How about that? I told y'all before, I didn't know that college football was a thing until I moved to Memphis. And I was like, oh, you could care about college football? 20-year-olds? Like, okay. To each of their own. Thank you for being here. You see any changes around the building? I wouldn't tell you how long it took us, but it was significant. So, very happy with the results so far. So we're going to be doing, just to give you kind of a sneak preview, when you go to our website, you'll know that we have a visual walking tour when you walk in the front doors to get your communion, and you're going to a classroom, and then you're going into the auditorium for worship. We're going to be redoing some of that stuff, updating it a little bit. Miss Faye over there has told me I need to get on it, so we're getting on it. We are in the book of Jonah this morning. It's interesting because we've been off for a couple of weeks with the holidays and so on, and I began Jonah last week talking about the minor prophets in chronological order, thereabouts. There's some debate on certain dates, and that doesn't really interest me as much as you might think, if you know how I talk about the history of some of the stuff. But we have a rough estimate, at least, based on who the kings were of Israel, northern tribes, and Judah, southern tribes. And so we have an idea of where they're going to fall. It doesn't really matter that much if one is flip-flopped. Doesn't really. But chronological is better because you get to see the scope of where you see Israel as a nation and Judah as a nation kind of sliding further and further down into being like all the other nations in a way. And so we begin it with a pretty positive note. Like, do you know how many negative criticisms there are about Israel or Judah in the book of Jonah? 0. There you go. 0. So the Assyrians, Nineveh, that great capital city of that empire, they're the bad guys, right, in this story. And so we see Jonah being called by God as a prophet to go to Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire, before they're really ramped up to be the Assyria that we know and don't like that much. Later on in history, he is called to go to them and to let them know what God thinks about their entire empire. So we've begun that conversation the last time we were together, and then I got a call from my mother. I'm sure she's watching right now. Hey, Mom. She wanted to know about some of the minor prophets. I go, well, I'm kind of teaching that. She goes, you are? I go, yep, sure are, Mom. I just started Jonah. She says, I have no idea what the whole thing about that fig plant that he had, and he was so mad about that. I don't get it. I was like, well, if you watch my class, instead of having a conversation, like Miss Betty over there, asked me to give her a full preview of my class one day before it's presented. I mean, great mind thinks alike. There you go. So anyway, so we're going through the text together. Again, my plan is to go through each of these books. They are shorter, thus the minor prophets, smaller material to get through. And then when we're done with one particular book, I showed a video at least twice from the Bible Project doing Mark, the Gospel account of Mark. And we'll use that to kind of wrap up our thoughts at the end of class. Not today, but it'll be in the probably next class or the class beyond that. Okay, before we get going, any questions, comments, concerns, thoughts you want to share with the class, anything like that?
Anxious back or something like that. If they're even around, they may come in late and leave early, but
Okay.
it's a step in the right direction. He will have a chemo this week
Okay.
that is quite strong. The other ones have not been strong, but this one he'll have to stay in the hospital overnight, and that will be Wednesday night to Thursday, and Thursday he will get his port, and they'll take the PICC line out, which will make everything in the future easier. So
Okay.
there's a lot going on this week with him.
Okay. Be praying for him, thinking about him. Don't crowd him too much.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Glad to hear it. I do gotta say, we have this song we sometimes sing. I haven't sung it here, I don't think, about making friends of God's family, God's people, right? It's probably a good thing. But I have noticed my wife has moved right in between Lisa and Mona. You can pull me aside afterwards if that's dangerous or not. I think I know the answer, but yep. All right, Book of Jonah. All right, we went through a little bit last time we were together and talked about why we're doing this study. I gave you a couple of examples. If you just go from like Joel or maybe Micah or Malachi or even Jonah, it's talked about frequently in the New Testament. Not a ton, but enough to where if you don't know the author and the book and the actual material, then you're kind of missing something that would have been more well known to the first century Jew. That's important to us because Jesus was a first century Jew, and he used that background to be able to establish a rapport with the well-learned people of the first century, the Pharisees, Sadducees, and scribes. And so when he has, for example, the illustration about, can you give us a sign from the Pharisees? He goes, I'm not going to give you a sign to prove something to you. You should know better because you have the scriptures. The only sign I'll give you is the sign of Jonah. He was 3 days and 3 nights, right, in the belly of the fish or whale, whatever you want to say. It doesn't matter that much to me. Then that's the sign I'll give you. Of course, being a reference to his 3 days in the tomb, according to the Jewish timeline anyway. So that's kind of important to know why we're doing this. If you don't have that information as to why this is important, it's very, very easy to tune me out. It is either anyway, right? So if you don't know why we're doing it, you kind of forget the importance of going through the text. So we began last week. I think we were looking somewhere around verse 3. Is that about right? Chapter 1, verse 3? You don't think so? 2? 2's fine. Let's just start over. We got 3 verses, right? I mean, why are we even talking about this? Come on. All right. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it. That was his mission, right? So what does it mean to call out against it? How would you rephrase that? Preach at them, right? Tell them how bad they are. Because their evil has come up before me. We talked about a little bit last week, or last time we were together, about the idea of things going up before God. That was one of the kind of lessons, I suppose, from my sermon on Christmas. You have the incense that would go up before the Lord, literally in a sense, going up to the heavens, and then also spiritually, symbolically, going up before God's throne room. That's the incense being the prayers of the saints, according to John in the book of Revelation. So that kind of going up before God, you see him in his judgment seat, you see him in his divine counsel, which is a whole other conversation, by the way. And then he has judgment against them. So, verse 3, But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. How's that going to work out for him? Not great, right? Because he's not just in Israel, which was, I think I mentioned last time, kind of a ancient Near East, Jewish, Canaanite, Egyptian kind of thing. You had your God, and your God controlled the people that were in a particular territory or boundary. And if you just got outside of that boundary, then you were kind of outside the presence of the local deity. When it comes to paganism, that's kind of how that worked. And so that's probably the way the author, probably Jonah, wrote it, was he's trying to get out of Israel so he's no longer bound to those terms of being a prophet. It's not going to work great. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. Now, this particular scene we find here, of course, is fleeing from God, right? He's running away from God. If you're looking for a kind of a note for chapter 1, running from God. That's probably a good little tagline to remember. There's 4 of them, 4 chapters, so you'll kind of see a theme, obviously. And then, so he's going to Joppa, port city. We also see in the book of Acts, around chapter 9, chapter 10, that's kind of where Peter was hanging out, on the roof of a house when the whole Cornelius conversion thing happened. So we kind of see some parallel in location, at least in that regard. So it's kind of good to know where it is. If you have a good study Bible, or if your Bible has maps in the back of ancient Israel, you might be able to see it. Some people include that because of Jonah and because of Peter in Acts, to kind of know where it is along the coastline. Not that important, but it is kind of a good thing to know. Okay, so he paid the fare and went down into it. What's the it? Ship. Okay, ship. To go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. So mentioned twice, chapter 3, first sentence, second clause, from the presence, and then at the end of verse 3, last clause, away from the presence of the Lord. So mentioned twice there to emphasize the point. I think I've mentioned before the idea of Hebrew parallelism. Right, we have parallelism in English, obviously, as well. You say something twice in different ways to emphasize the point. Anyone remember my example? Each and every. Each means every, and every means each, but we say each and every. We're emphasizing all of y'all, right? That's the idea. Okay, so verse 4, but the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. What does that mean? Big storm comes through, ship's going to fall apart. Okay, that's all it means. Verse 5, then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God. What does that indicate to us immediately? Worshipped idols, right? They did not worship Jehovah God. Each called out to their or his God, meaning there was more than one God being cried to from the ship. Kind of gives you an idea of what this prophet of Jehovah God, Yahweh God, is doing and willing to be around to get away from his God, right? He's willing to go with people that are Gentiles, not Israelites, to be able to flee from the presence of God. Usually prophets are kind of seen as spokesmen for their God, right? So if you got a prophet trying to run away from his God, that's kind of an inverted kind of thing to see here in the text. And they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. Why is that what they did? Okay, so you got the cargo in the ship, and the ship goes down because cargo usually weighs things, right? This is feathers. Who carry feathers around? You throw it over the sea to kind of increase the buoyancy of the vessel, and that would hopefully give you some more leeway when it comes to the waves that are coming through. That's just the idea. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship and had laid down and was fast asleep. So he doesn't seem to be too troubled by the storm, nor with the lives of the mariners being threatened here, or the tempest. He seems like just content because he's no longer on that mission from God to go to Nineveh and tell them how bad they are. So it's interesting how he's able to rest, kind of being in the midst of all of this, because he's running away from his responsibility. Any thoughts about that? You know, any parallels that's kind of similar to this? All right, Jesus on the boat, right? Big storm comes along. All the apostles are freaking out because they think they're going to die, and they go down there and wake Jesus up. Don't you care that we're about to die? Like, you know, it's Jesus still in the boat, so it's going to be okay, right? That's the lesson there, obviously, or a lesson from it. So the captain came and said to him, "What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us that we may not perish." And that's kind of a pretty good way to frame how the ancient Near East cultures dealt with their gods. Maybe if we just do something, they'll pay attention to us for a moment and then give us something that we request, right? That's kind of a basic idea of a magic genie that you've got in your land, that maybe if you just do the right thing, he'll pay attention for a second and help you in your time of need. That would be true for childbearing, be true for a harvest season, be true for combat or warfare. If they just do something, maybe their God will give them an edge, is kind of the idea. And that was their thought for Jonah. Can you please talk to your God, and maybe he'll think of us for a minute, and then we'll be able to live through this? Any questions, comments, thoughts about that? That's all set up, by the way. Okay, verse 7, Jonah chapter 1. And they said to one another, "Come, let us cast lots, that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us." So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. So what's that mean? All right, so they know that Jonah's the cause for the storm and for this calamity. The casting of lots, we talked about the idea of dice was a popular thought from y'all. Maybe. I mean, dice is that ancient for sure, and even predates this book. But casting of lots is a game of chance or a sign of chance, and then whatever the result would be, that kind of indicates something to us. They cast lots for Jesus' garments. Someone had to take it, and so they cast lots. They played a game of chance to see who would take away his garments. I mean, that's just one idea. But just so you know, that's the idea on the actual verse. There's also something interesting here in verse 7 about the way that not just these people, but us as human beings think about these kind of tragedies and calamities, right? Whenever there's a hurricane, I grew up on the east coast of Virginia. There's hurricanes every year, pretty much. Some are worse than others, but it's just one of those things you deal with. At least in Virginia, you got hurricane season, then you've got ice storm season, then you've got blistering heat and humidity in the summer. So you got the whole range of all the fun stuff weather-wise. So the idea of a tragedy or calamity or natural disaster happening, we as people want answers, don't we? Especially if we ourselves are affected, or our family members are affected by some great tragedy. We're looking for an explanation, looking for a reason as to why. That's a big response. And a lot of people go through things in life where they don't get a satisfactory answer as to why this bad thing happened. And because of that, they grow a bit bitter when it comes to not just the idea of religion or God or Christianity, but just the world in general is bad and evil because something affected them in a very personal way. And so it's a little bit comforting, I might say, to see that people in this day and age, when they were on a ship, that's what they were doing, they're mariners, and a great storm happened, and thought they were all going to die, it seems from the text, they want to know why. So that natural human curiosity and wonder as to what's the big picture, what's the plan here, for me it's comforting to know that this thought is not a strange thing. It's a natural human response. Or you have to have something about that. Okay, Chris. Oh, sure. And they just figure out
in this case
who it was. Yeah, right? If you remember in the New Testament, you've got this thing where they walk by someone who was crippled in some way, usually hands or legs or feet. And Peter had a question about that, right? Do you remember the question? Whose fault? Who sinned to be able to have this guy be crippled? Was it his sin or was it his parents' sin? That was their question. And Jesus didn't even really address it in that kind of way, but that was the common theme or thought Among normal Jewish people in the first century, if something happened to you bad, the reason is God's punishing you, either because of your personal sin or the sins of your ancestors, is the idea. And that's actually a pretty biblical thought in one regard, because there are passages from the law of Moses talking about the sins of the generation being passed down for at least 16 generations in some instances. So it's interesting how that kind of connects itself. Maybe not the sin that was done 16 generations, but the consequence of that sin would be an idea to bring up there. So, anything else?
For the new covenant and the old covenant, there were certain sacrifices they had to do for their sins, and they didn't do it. There was a punishment for them.
Yeah, there was, right? I mean, this is talking about the Israelites going from Egypt to Canaan. It took a little bit longer than expected, to be fair. But there were numerous cases where either a plague or a pestilence or a bunch of poisonous snakes showed up out of nowhere to punish the people because something was going wrong. Usually complaining was the big issue. Which, by the way, kind of a side note for us, the reason why we have all that material and we have all that text to go through about their wilderness wanderings is because we're not supposed to be just picking on the Jewish nation as people that are just full of complainers. That's not the point. The point is that's a microcosm of the people of God and wandering in the world where they're not really at home yet, and then they're being led by God's person in the role, right? So it's an image really of the church. We are the Israelites wandering from Egypt, sin and slavery, to the promised land, heaven, the eternal realm. And along the way, there are certain pitfalls that they fell into, one of which was complaining and murmuring against God's people, and that was punished visually for us to learn the lesson from that, right? I'm an only child, if you can't tell. Apparently people can tell. I don't know why. I'm not a narcissist. I don't really get it, but people can tell. I don't share well with toys and stuff when I was a kid. But I did have a cousin who was like a brother to me growing up. And so, I mean like a brother in the sense that I was picked on incessantly. I mean, people always believed him, never believed me. Just the whole drama stuff as a kid growing up. But a couple of times, there were instances where I had a thought in my little brain. And I wanted to see whether or not it was a good thought or a bad thought. And so what do? Well, what I did was told my mom what I was thinking about doing, but I didn't say I was thinking about doing it. I said, hey, my cousin did this. Would I get in trouble if I did the same thing? That was the game, right? And the answer was always yes. I mean, yeah, don't do that. But in a similar kind of way, if you have a sibling growing up that one that's older than you learn lessons from that older sibling, don't you? You do. You see what they get in trouble for, what they're praised for, and you kind of either buck that entirely and become your own person, or you learn from that experience and kind of get guided by their example. Same exact process happens here for the Christian. We look back into our older brother's account, the Israelite nation, and we see what they did, and if God was praising them for doing what he requested of them, or if they were punished in some severe way, we learn those lessons and apply them to our walk with the same God. Same God. Different circumstance, different covenant, different relationship in a way, but still same God. So, anyway, verse 7, that's what they're thinking about here. Who is at fault? And they figured it was Jonah. Verse 8, then they said to him, tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation? Where do you come from? What's your country? And of what people are you? So they're very interested now in Jonah because they know that he's the reason why this calamity is upon them. And he's going to kind of write himself out. Verse 9, he said to them, I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord. So capital L-O-R-D indicates what to us from the text? Jehovah God, Yahweh God, whatever you prefer. Yahweh's technically more correct, but who's counting? the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." The men were exceedingly afraid and said to him, "What is this that you have done?" For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord, because he told them. So, how many times in chapter 1, verses 1 through 10, do we have the phrase "fleeing from the presence of the Lord" mentioned here? 3. Right? Pretty important. If it's 3 times in 10 verses, seems significant, right? What's the old saying? Is it in the Bible once, it's important because that's God's word. If it's mentioned multiple times, pay attention to it. Something like that. That's kind of the gist. That's the gist of chapter 1. He's fleeing from the presence of the Lord. And then verse 11, "Then they said to him, 'What shall we do to you that the sea may quiet down for us, because the sea grew more and more tempestuous?'" So they're looking for a solution to their problem. They say the sea is a problem for us because we're on a ship after all. We want the storm to go away. We know that you are at fault. You're fleeing from the presence of the Lord your God, Yahweh God, because he just told us that. What do we do to stop this problem? Which is a very logical, pragmatic way to go about the idea. Hey, how do we fix it? Now, here's a question for you. I don't have a good answer to, but maybe you do. Verse 12. "He said to them, 'Pick me up and hurl me into the sea, then the sea will quiet down for you, because I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you.'" Here's my question. Do you think he knew that that was the case? Yeah? No doubt, apparently. Why do you say yeah and... Okay.
I think his conscience, he knew the whole time.
I think it's
the wrong thing.
Okay, his conscience told him that he was in the wrong. So the solution...
God told him to do this.
Okay.
God.
So did God tell him, "Hey, by the way, just have them throw you in the water, we're all good"?
No, maybe he thought, okay, I'll try to run away, throw me in the sea, and hey, God's a pretty good guy, he'll save me then.
Okay, all right. That's where I'm going, a little bit. Mind reader, we're connected, Lisa. You ready? Throw me in the sea, God will save me, right? Because he's a good guy, I'm a good guy. We're just have a misunderstanding. That's one thought. That's the assumed thought, I suppose. What's the other thought? What's in the mind of Jonah when he says, "Hey, just throw me over there"? Okay, he's guilty, trying to flee God. Did he think he was going to die if you're thrown into stormy waters?
Said, "I'm trying to flee from the Lord, throw me in." I mean, he didn't say anything about the Lord, but he said, "Throw me in."
Right. So here's the question I don't have an answer to. Maybe him being a prophet of God, having a measure of the Spirit of God, being influenced by the Holy Spirit, whatever you want to say, him having that connection gave him special insight into the scenario and the solution. Right? Throw me in the sea. It's my fault. You guys will be okay. But maybe not. Maybe he's just a guy that knows if he listens to what God told him to do as a prophet and goes through with the mission, going to Nineveh, going to Assyria, he would rather drown to death than go to Nineveh himself. Maybe. I'm not going to say for sure because I don't have a verse for it. Right? That's kind of how that works. But maybe Jonah was so desperate, he's saying, "I don't want to go to Assyria. I've heard what they do. The fish hooks through noses and through cheeks and dragging people out of their homes. I don't want to do that. I'm not going to a whole nation of them, the biggest city they have. I'm not doing that. So just kill me. I'd rather die. Throw me in the water, kill me, and then y'all be okay, I guess. I mean, I'll be gone, so who cares?" Maybe that's a thought. Don't know for sure. But if you've only ever heard, okay, he was a prophet, and he knew that God told him if he was thrown over, he'd be okay. Maybe that's not the case. It doesn't really matter a ton, but it does matter if you've only ever heard one thing and you've never heard the other thing, right? It's kind of how Bible study works. There were new ideas, right?
Had to find out fault,
Right?
and then what do we need to do to correct the fault? So it's that thought process that was of a normal belief then.
Okay.
You gotta find the culprit and get rid of it, and he was of that culture.
One of the things that happens when you know the story before you read it in this kind of way is your mind kind of fills in the blanks for you. So if
He's
he's
thrown into the sea, what's going to happen? A big fish is going to swallow him. Do you know the story already? Not new to anybody else here, right? So that's one of the benefits I've got of not growing up in the church, is I didn't know anything about Jonah before I read it. So I'm like, oh, he's looking to die right here. He says, throw me in the water. I'm going to drown. I'd rather die than go to Nineveh. And then like a big fish comes along and swallows him, and he's cool for a couple days. Like, I mean, I'm with you, but I mean, that's not how I thought that story was going to go, right? And so the reason why I say all of that is to say, if your mind is filling in the gap saying, yeah, throw me over, a big fish is going to come along, well, I'll repent and things will be okay. That's not how Jonah's thinking about it. He doesn't have that foreknowledge as far as we know in this moment. And here's one more reason to kind of show us that he's looking to die. Verse 13, nevertheless, because of what he said, the men rowed hard to get back to dry land, but they could not because the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. And so, if the answer is throw the guy into the sea, get swallowed by the great fish, everything's cool for the fishermen, then they wouldn't have tried so hard not to kill him or throw him into the water to be drowned. Verse 14, therefore they called out to the Lord, which is interesting, because they're people that don't know Jehovah God as far as we know, or at least they know of him, but maybe not personally. They call out to Yahweh, and we are kind of implied in the text here that God in his throne room, is that's the right kind of phraseology, is aware of what's going on in mankind's heart and lives, and they're coming up before him like the nation of Assyria. O Lord, let us not perish for or because of this man's life, and do not lay innocent blood on us, for you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you. Interesting way that they kind of talk to God, because that's kind of the way Israel's supposed to talk to God. Verse 15, so they picked up Jonah, they hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Was it miraculous?
Jonah just threw himself.
It wasn't personal.
why didn't Jonah throw himself?
He knew that was the key. Not expecting an answer.
You're not going to get one, but I'm just thinking about it.
I mean, he knew what needed to be done to take care of the issue.
Did he?
Now, unless it was to be an example for the men there that, you know, I'm here, God's doing this because I am here, throw me over to, you know, maybe, I don't know, at the last minute, you know, get them to turn to his God.
That would be a very, very rosy-colored pair of glasses to wear when talking about Jonah.
Yeah.
He was like, in the boat, was like, you know what, as one last thing before I die, let's convert these guys.
You know, that's best case scenario. Just boop.
Right?
Okay, I'm gonna do this.
Yeah, throw me over. I mean, okay, so one thought that comes to mind, don't know where it's coming from, but it's the idea of sometimes people that are looking to have their lives ended would rather not do it themselves. Suicide by cop, you know what that is? Right, you draw a weapon on a police officer, he's got to defend himself. I mean, different versions of that story, but the story all kind of ends the same, essentially.
You get taken down, weapon removed, and you're out of luck, or they have to shoot you to defend themselves or defend somebody else. That's a thought. But I'm not convinced, personally, for what it's worth, that Jonah knew that the sea would stop the storm if he died. I think he just wanted out. If I'm right or not doesn't really matter to the text. just a thought. I think he didn't have any evidence that the sea would actually stop. He's just like, get me out of here. I'm done. I'm not going to Nineveh. That's one thing I know for sure. So if it takes me dying in the ocean by a great storm, take me out. But in verse 15, it's exactly what happened. So either Jonah knew that was the answer because he's a prophet and they had that connection, or God just gave them the blessing of his sacrifice. Verse 16, then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. It's a little confusing to me because it's a little weird, right?
That worked, and they offered a sacrifice to him.
Did they know because the sea stopped? It seems miraculous, right, in the text, so this God's real. Like, he's in charge right now. He's doing his thing. Whether or not they made the full connection that he is the only God and their pagan gods don't exist, don't know for sure. They did offer a sacrifice. Were they authorized to? I hate that word, but were they supposed to?
Could have with their gods.
Hey, who knows if it was even worthy?
I know pretty certainly they're not Levites. All right, this is Moses' law in effect here.
I mean, they're sacrifices.
Well, even the Israelites, when something strong happened,
Yeah.
they feared the Lord and offered
Right.
sacrifices. It didn't make them, they stayed true to.
True. My point is, it seems weird that their first thought is to make a sacrifice to the Lord. We assume an animal sacrifice, right? No, I do anyway. They're not Levites, so they don't know about the law yet, but they still kind of got, it seems, the respect that God was in charge. Okay? So it seems interesting, at least, that maybe that's what they would have done to their pagan god. If something goes well, they got their God's attention, and to say thank you, they offer a sacrifice and they make vows, which is a different thing, but similar, right? A religious rite, you're making a vow of doing something or not doing something for God's sake. So maybe that's what they would have done for their pagan god, and they say, hey, oh, this God's here now, so okay, here you go, this is what we do. That's probably the case. Or maybe they had some insight into what Yahweh wanted from their previous knowledge and tried to do that. Whatever the case here, we don't see any kind of judgment from God in one way or the other about verse 16 of Jonah 1. But it's interesting, right? It's interesting that they had that kind of process. They came to that realization because of what Jonah said. I doubt Jonah knew for sure God's going to follow through and stop the storm. That's my personal doubt. I think he was like, I'm out of here. I'm not doing this. I'm not going to Nineveh no matter what. So kill me instead. So they killed him, they thought, and then everybody's good. And then verse 17. So one more thing to pay attention to in the book of Jonah, for a special note, is the Lord appointed, or the Lord chose, or the Lord made. There are special things throughout this book that if you pay attention to that one little tagline, you see how much, it's not the right word, but it's close, the most preparation that God had made for all these events to unfurl in the way that it does in the text. So he appointed Jonah as a prophet to Israel, right? He appointed a great storm or tempest to come upon the ship in which Jonah was trying to flee from his mission. He appointed the people to be able to inquire why the storm was there. Then he appointed Jonah to be thrown over the ship and possibly die and drowned in the sea. And then, verse 17, the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah. That's where my little 15-year-old brain was like, what? I didn't have any Bible class growing up as a kid. Had no idea who Jonah was. Didn't know about the whale or the fish, whatever you want to call them. And so I'm like, I'm with you, but I didn't see that happening. The Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And I think in my little brain immediately, okay, so he's dead now for sure, and now he's just fish food. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights.
Not dead, it seems, alive in the belly, right? Thoughts about that? I have to have something, because it's not a normal sentence to read in any other book. What's that?
That was very pleasant.
I mean, it must have smelled great. If you like tuna cans, and I'm sure it was awesome. What kind of fish was it? I don't know. We say whale because they're big. It doesn't really matter what it was. Probably sure it's not the Leviathan.
From the book of Job. We've had some time between Job and Jonah. They don't quite match up. But he's in the belly. Anything else? All right, we're going to stop here this morning. This is going to be the new protocol, I think, unless the elders tell me otherwise. When it comes to the first bell of Sunday morning Bible class, we've got 20 minutes now to be able to converse and talk and chat and see each other until worship begins. So thank you for your attention this morning. We'll pick up here in chapter 2, verse 1 next week, Lord willing. And we will be rolling through the text here. At the very end of the text, we'll do the Bible Project video. If you want to go ahead and look on YouTube and watch that before class begins, that might give you a good bird's eye picture of the book, chapters 1 through 4, so you know where we're going and how we're going to get there. Okay? So thank you so much for your time and your attention. We'll be dismissed now for about 20 minutes before worship begins.